Yes, please.
Published? No, this is just something I wrote for here.
You gotta publish this, man. Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
Who do you suppose is going to publish a 5,200 word thing like this?
Well, you know,
You will.
last year's conference, Chesterton, was great. I loved it. It was fantastic. But this is brilliant.
I'm going to have to remember that. Next time when I give another talk, I'm just going to have to tell myself just drink a ton of coffee beforehand, get amped up on caffeine, and then just rant.
That's how we do it.
Really?
Okay, class, questions. The floor is open.
Just I guess a quick question about the Frankfurt School stuff. I don't know a ton about the Frankfurt School stuff, but I've heard like people that kind of talk about that theory, like that they're responsible for everything. I guess I just wanted to see if you could clarify a little more of that about like, you know, maybe the Frankfurt radicals are the ones who compromise liberal education. And what's the relationship there? Like why it's not the Frankfurt School of deconstructionism or whatever they do.
Well, I hate looking at this recording thing, so I'm going to turn it over. Okay, so the idea is that there were these guys in Germany, I think they're going to like the Goethe school or whatever in Frankfurt, and they fled Germany, I think when Hitler took power, came to the United States, and then they laid eggs in the universities, and those eggs hatched Frankfurt communists, and then those Frankfurt communists laid eggs, and those eggs hatched Frankfurt communists, and so on and so forth until you have our present state in which supposedly Frankfurt communists run all the universities. That's my understanding. Is that your understanding of this theory? Okay.
But you say it's more liberals.
Well, what do you think? What sounds more realistic to you? What I'm saying, that the nature of liberalism, which believes there's no defect in human nature, and thus believes education can perfect man. Once you believe in the no defect in human nature, the perfectibility of man follows from that. The means of achieving that perfectibility, of achieving an earthly paradise, is education, going to the school, working in the school as a teacher or education bureaucrat or something. That's what I'm saying. I think that makes a lot of sense, okay? That's based on what Burnham said in his fantastic book, which is the greatest critique of liberalism ever written, which is Suicide of the West. I'm basing what I'm saying on that. I'm saying it's the nature of liberalism itself. Then we have the Frankfurt theory, which I outlined when I began answering your question. Which do you think is more realistic?
No, I tend to agree with your opinion.
I agree with me too. Yeah. You're a smart man. It's ironic because you kind of look like Chris Rufo a little bit.
Really?
Yeah. I got nervous when you put your hand up. I'm like, oh, here he comes. You know, I mean, look, there's probably some truth to that. I'm not saying that didn't happen. I'm not saying that these guys didn't come here. I'm not saying that they didn't have students. What I am saying is that there's a lot of blanks here that you're not filling in. Not you, but Rufo and the people who are saying this. In this chain, you're saying there's this chain that links the Frankfurt School to our present day, to the university today. I'm not seeing all the links in this chain. And I'm just saying this is very, very unlikely. And frankly, a lot of those Frankfurt guys, it's like they're a little bit more diverse in some of their views than people tend to remember today. I'm no expert, but, my big beef with it really is this. It takes our eye off the ball. We should be looking at the nature of liberalism and how the nature of liberalism compels people to go to the school, get jobs in the school, and then destroy identity and dismantle any sense of identity. That's the thing I think we should be looking at, not the conspiracy theory. That conspiracy theory takes our eye off the nature of liberalism. Yep.
You make too, though, that there in both of those answers have, but you noted specifically that there is an enemy with a flamethrower.
Yeah.
So how do you how do you see that playing out when you're building something in the middle of a war zone? How do you protect your assets when you're building a school?
Man, that's a very practical question. I wish I knew more about what it takes to build a school, but I think that's what we have to do. I think we have to build our own schools. I think if you actually go into one of these universities and you try to teach, I mean, I'm sure this is a great place. I'm sure the seminary is great, but like if
You get fired at any normal university.
I mean, I think wouldn't any decent person have a difficult time there? If I go there and I try to teach at U of M, it's like trying to light a match in a room with no oxygen. You can't do it. I think we need to establish our own schools. I think we need to look at the classical curriculum. I think we need to ask, like, what is the goal of the curriculum? The word curriculum itself denotes, or the meaning of it, etymologically, it refers to a race. Every race has an end or a finish line. This is something John Sr. talks about in his book, The Restoration of Christian Culture. He says we need to think more about the end, the goal of the curriculum, just as we need to think more about the end or the goal of like every lecture, or the end or the goal of every class. I mean, a good teacher has in his mind that one point he's trying to lead the student towards in the lecture, or as he asks them questions. He's not just asking them questions to see like, oh, did they do the reading or didn't they do the reading? He's trying to lead them somewhere. That's what a good teacher does. And so from a practical level, that's really all I can tell you. I just don't know enough about the struggles of starting a school and what that takes. Pray to St. Jude. All right.
There's some experiments like Chesterton Academy.
Yeah, they're great.
Which are good, yeah. And speaking of John Sr., some of his students from Kansas ended up going to Congo over to France and coming back to the States and founding Clear Creek Abbey out in Oklahoma. So that was their sort of alternative to the culture.
Indeed. Russell Kirk talks about the Institute for Humanities program, the IHP at the University of Kansas, in his book, Decadence and Renewal in the Higher Education. I have a copy of it here with me if you'd like to look at it. But he had great respect for what John Sr. did at the IHP. And it's also curious that he says the chief complaint against the IHP was that it lacked diversity of opinion. People were saying, whoa, this thing where you study all this Western stuff, it just lacks diversity of opinion, and it doesn't have enough free exchange, free and open inquiry. That's really what we need. We need a free marketplace of ideas in the IHP. You know, it's like, can't we ever have an authority figure? He who has care for the community has to always be replaced by some invisible hand mechanism. It's like, enough already. This is dumb. You know, Senior has that very funny description of the modern class discussion in The Restoration of Christian Culture in the chapter, A Final Solution to Liberal Education. He kind of jokes because he talks about the etymology of the word discussion, and he says cushion means hitting or bashing against, as in percussion, percussionist instruments, drums, as in concussion with hitting. You get hit hard, you get a concussion. And he says the modern discussion is one where these kids just have at it and just like assert and emote at each other and hit each other. And he says there's no understanding and the teacher doesn't lead them anywhere. And some people actually call that the Socratic method, which it's not. That's dumb. The Socratic method involves asking questions to lead the students somewhere. That's not the Socratic method. That's the invisible hand at work in the so-called free market of ideas, where there is no understanding, just standing over, as he said, jokes.
I thought the burning house analogy was really good.
Thank you. Yeah, I like that analogy. It's a bit dramatic, but I think it does the job.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I think about what I would save from the house. And I think about this thing that I still have that I made for my mother. It's this clay thing I made when I was in like 3rd grade. And it's made of clay, and then we put the clay thing in a oven or a kiln or something, and it hardens, and it says number 1 mom, and it's got these little yarn things hanging from the clay and some beads on it. And I think I can't remember what the holiday was, but it is a sign. It calls to mind, to memory, my mother. And it calls to mind all the memories I have hanging out with my mother and doing things with my mother. And when you're a little boy, you know, the first woman you fall in love with is your mom, your mother. And if you can recall, if you went to a public school like I did, when you had art class, what would you always make? When Valentine's Day rolled around, who was your Valentine? On Valentine's Day, you always made something for your mother. And then when Mother's Day would roll around, you'd make a second gift for your mother. And then when Father's Day rolled around, you'd make a third gift for your mother. At least that's what I did. But that's what I would save. I would save that thing, number one mom that I made. One of the things I would save.
Questions, class?
Isn't anybody offended?
Nah, you're-
I bought tickets.
All right, what do you want?
I'm not offended. I do sometimes consider myself a recovering neocon, though, or maybe like a recovering liberal because of the education that I got through the public schools and through...
Education by liberals, not
Yeah.
liberal education.
Exactly, yeah. So I guess my question is, and I'm just thinking about, especially like here in Detroit, we tend to value different cultures that are present, like we have, and don't worry about offending anybody else here, I don't think. We have, of course, Mexican town in southwest Detroit, and you have like, Hamtramck used to be very strongly Polish. Now it's a lot of Islamic folks. But yeah, how do you sort of balance this wanting to preserve identity and talk about assimilation, which seems valuable based on, throughout your whole argument, but also like the way that we still celebrate these other cultures that we have. Like it's a tension that I'm not sure how to resolve, right? I don't want to be like, well, just be more American, whatever that identity is, because you see some of the richness that each of them bring. So you can help me to understand that.
Well, as Russell Kirk would say, America has a distinctly British culture. And we see that even reflected in our laws, and even in the phrases in like the Constitution, such as due process. They go back to English common law. They go all the way back to Magna Carta. Now, how do you preserve that British culture? How do you preserve this Anglo-American Western understanding of law? How do you conserve all these other things without offending people? I think the first thing we need to do is we need to stop tearing down every last remnant and symbol and monument to our patrimony, to the symbols that stand for our heroes and these people who are a part of our past. They are a part of our past with their scars and warts and imperfections. And I don't think we should desecrate their memory. I don't think that we should, what I mean by that is I don't think we should try to expel them from public view or tear down their monuments. These things are a part of who we are. They're a part of our story. So we should stop rolling over before every person who points at a statue or a monument or a cultural symbol who says that's racist and therefore it needs to go. I think we should tell those people to go pound sand. I mean, and if you're not willing to do that, I got bad news for you. You're going to lose everything. I can remember Father Sirico, God bless him. He runs the Acton Institute on the west side of the state. He was speaking here at a Young Catholic Professionals event, and I asked him at some point during the Q&A, well, Lord Acton, you named your group, your nonprofit after Lord Acton. Lord Acton was a believer in state sovereignty, and he was friends with Robert E. Lee. They exchanged at a fairly lengthy correspondence. He was a supporter of the Southern cause. So you have to keep in mind, this is like right when Black Lives Matter was getting geared up and protesting stuff and tearing stuff down. So I said, so, Father Sirico, when the BLM protesters show up outside the Acton Institute and say that you are a racist for honoring Lord Acton, or you have to change the name of the Acton Institute, what are you going to do? Now, I can't remember exactly what his answer was. It lasted like 5 minutes. I didn't really get a clear answer to the question, I don't think. But I would tell those people to go pound sand. I mean, or else there goes Lord Acton. G.K. Chesterton was a supporter. You can find plenty of places, such as what I saw in America, where he says that the American Civil War was a victory of merchants over squires. I mean, he waxes poetic about the valor of Robert E. Lee. Now, are we going to discard Chesterton now because he saw beauty and value in the Southern cause? No, I don't think we should do that. I think we need to stand firm. And, now that I brought that up, just a little footnote on that. What I believe Chesterton is doing when he goes down these weird historical rabbit holes, I know this doesn't have anything to do with the talk, but I'm just going to note this because I went down this road. When Chesterton goes down these weird historical rabbit holes and he starts waxing poetic about the valor of Robert E. Lee, or saying something about the Cavaliers and the valor of the Cavaliers, beating the Roundheads and whatever in the English Civil War, what I think he's trying to do, I think it's clear when you read that stuff, Chesterton is not the greatest historian, but he is saying something that he thinks is going to provoke the ire of three groups of people that he does not like. And there were entire groups of people that Chesterton had animus for. The feminists, the industrialists or capitalists, and the perfidious Puritans. Chesterton, I think, had more contempt for the Puritans than anybody I've ever found. So I think that when he praises the Southern cause or the Southern tradition, he's thinking, man, this is really going to inflict some real butthurt on the Puritans or the feminists and the industrialists. I mean, the industrialists and Puritans were on the side of the North, the Union. But I don't know how I'm sorry. I have this topic, this tendency to meander sometimes. Go ahead.
So, I would like to ask you about the connection between liberalism attacking the patrimony, the identity, and most specifically the patrimony. How does that relate to the more kind of like the feminist movement of just being wholly anti-man and anti-father? How does that relate to each other?
That's a very interesting question. The person who really gets into that, who might shed some light on that, is James Burnham in his aforementioned book, Suicide of the West. Because it seems to me that we have two different things there, don't we? You're saying we've got this group of people over here, liberals, who want to divorce a man from his identity, from his patrimony, from his heritage. But then you've got this other group that is actively hating his identity, his patrimony, and whatever. His patrimony and all these things that make him who he is. So, on one hand, it seems that liberals should be maybe somewhat indifferent to white men, but at the same time, do they really sound indifferent to white men? Don't they sound like they hate white men?
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing to ponder. We tend to draw this distinction where we say that those who are indifferent to all of these things and think that they're unnecessary and extra, such as nationality and heritage, are liberals. And then we say that people who resent certain Western nationalities and Western ways are the far left. And we make that distinction. What Burnham argues in his book is that the liberals are linked to the far left through shared philosophical common ground. It links them, this shared philosophical common ground, to the radical left and distinguishes them from the right. And he says this kind of explains why in the 20th century you've got the so-called liberals who decry violence and coercion, constantly harping about apartheid South Africa or some tin pot dictator in South America like Augusto Pinochet, but they don't have anything bad to say about Stalin. They don't talk about the Soviet Union's atrocities. Why do they only attack these so-called right-wing despots who are violent and killing people and never attack the left-wing despots who are killing people? After all, liberalism is supposed to be, borrowing a phrase from Arthur Schlesinger, I can't say that name, Arthur Schlesinger, who's a speechwriter for John Kennedy and a historian. In one of his books, he refers to liberalism as the vital center, the vital center. And this was a big project of liberals in the middle of the 20th century, to define the liberal, to place the liberal in the middle of the political spectrum between the radical right and the radical left. But we constantly see the liberal punching rightward and extending an open hand leftward. They'll talk all day about Hitler, but they don't want to talk about Stalin. They will talk about the violent man who kills a lot of people to assert some sense of identity, but they're not going to talk about some communist leader who, for the sake of equality or the sake of whatever ideological reasons, sent all these people to the gulags or starved 5 million Ukrainians in the Holodomor. So why is that? And Burnham says it's because of a certain philosophical common ground that liberals share with the radical left. A belief in the plasticity of human nature, a belief in the perfectibility of man. Those are a few of the things that Burnham mentions. So translating that today into the situation you present us with, I think there are a lot of people, a lot of they call themselves classical liberals, who say they don't hate anybody and say they are against hate, but they consistently identify hate with the far right. And they don't identify hate or call anybody a hater who's on the far left, even though you can find plenty of people on the far left who will march in streets and get violent. Does that answer your question or come close to answering it?
Kind of. Not really.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. Do you want me to clarify the question?
Sure.
I guess what I've been seeing from liberalism is wanting to take the father out of the home.
Oh,
and
yes.
Out of not just out of the home, family-wise, but also like detach us, like the society, from again our heritage and which is usually done through the father,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you talk about like they don't want to save the family album, or maybe the family tree if you have a printed out thing with the family tree or something like that. And like I see that like they relate like, oh, the father's bad news, and that could just go way into more of the spiritual daddy issues with God the Father, which it usually is. But like think about like a lot of liberals tend to be like, hate the founding fathers. They use, rhetoric like, oh, well, Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner and blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
But what they really don't like is the fact that he was a founding father. I guess that's where I was going with that, in terms of they're attacking the patrimony.
So you've got about 3 minutes.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, sorry. But yeah, that's where I was
The
going.
problem is that's its own separate talk.
Yeah.
The anti-male nature of modern left-wing thinking is its own separate talk.
Oh, okay.
And as is the weird ethnomasochism that pervades left-wing thinking today. Mr. Rufo lookalike?
Yes, another question. So I think you're saying liberal education is needs to be, I guess, used as a vehicle for conservatives for kind of to shift the culture
Absolutely.
and all that. I guess just curious, like the next step in that in your thinking. It seems like America, the framework of America, the West is liberalism. So just it seems implied that that would have to change if liberal education is used as to shift the culture. Is there another kind of political framework that you'd say is like the next step or change from liberalism?
Well, we need to reinstate the Habsburgs, obviously. I mean, that's a joke. That's a joke. I would just note that, like, on the question of, like, form of government, I really lose interest on debates concerning the form of government, I would note. I'm more concerned with the end, the goal of telos of government, which is to habituate us to virtue, to make virtuous life possible, ultimately the achievement of eudaimonia, of happiness in the political community. But I really need to give that some more thought. That you ask a good question. Now, America having a liberal heritage, or America being founded on some sort of liberalism, Russell Kirk kind of would deny that understanding of America. He sees a conservative tradition in America. He sees America as being a sort of, everybody says it's the perfect Enlightenment nation, or it's an Enlightenment nation founded on these liberal ideas, these Lockean phrases in the first two paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. Kirk, in a book called The Conservative Constitution, claims that these phrases in the Constitution, as I was saying, go back to English common law. And the founders were not really revolutionaries. The American War for Independence was a revolution not made but prevented. And what the Americans were saying was that we are reclaiming our rights as Englishmen that go back to Magna Carta. That's what we're doing, and the radicals are in Parliament. And now, at this time in mid-1770s, we have been left largely alone for a good long time. That's what Edmund Burke referred to this relationship between the British Empire and us as salutary neglect. You've left us alone for a very long time. Now, all of a sudden, you're taxing us to pay off some debts you have from some war that doesn't involve us. You're not taxing us much, but that is none of our damn business, and you shouldn't be taxing us to pay this off. That's silly, and so we're going to secede from you. Now, that's more the traditional conservative interpretation of the American founding, of the American War for Independence. It's not really a radical break-off from tradition. It's a continuing of a tradition going back to Magna Carta. That's the way that Kirk viewed it. Now, some people would say Kirk was an Anglophile, and if you're an Anglophile, how do you explain the American Revolution? Well, you just say, well, we were better Englishmen than the English, which is almost what he's saying. How do you explain all these Enlightenment phrases in the Declaration of Independence? Kirk says, well, only 5 men signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. The Constitution is our highest source of law. It's much more important. Those first two paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence, where you see the social contract, where you see this radical notion of individual rights, human rights and whatever, he would say that was just rhetorical flourish written by a crazed Jacobin named Jefferson, who wasn't at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, thank God. And so I'm not saying I believe this, by the way. I'm just trying to tell you what Kirk said, because I do see a bit of a problem here. I do think that America is largely, in our documents, you do see Enlightenment liberalism. But for me, the American founding isn't really guys writing a piece of paper saying that we don't like the old. It isn't a group of aristocrats, a small group of aristocrats in Philadelphia saying we don't like the old system of law, so we're creating a new one. The founding of America is the pioneers who came here and conquered it and set up colonies and set up a new civilization. I mean, that's the founding. I mean, I think of 1607 in Jamestown. I think of the Puritans landing on Plymouth Rock in 1620, whatever. You know, that's what I think of as being the founding. And as Chesterton says, you know, the Puritans landed on Plymouth Rock, but we would all be much better off if Plymouth Rock had landed upon the Puritans. Yes?
Time is upon us, but did you want to say anything about the books you brought or not?
Oh, sure. I mean, if you want, you can come up and look at them. I don't know if you have time.
Yeah.
I was thinking that maybe the Q&A would lead me to want to pull something from one of the books.
Okay.
That's a big part of the reason I took them. But,
Maybe you can just name them real quickly.
well, this is Suicide of the West by James Burnham. This is Rationalism in Politics and Other Essays by Michael Oakeshott. And then, of course, I cited John Senior's book, The Restoration of Christian Culture. And this is The Wise Men Know What Wicked Things Are Written in the Sky by Russell Kirk. It's a series of lectures he gave in the early 90s at the Heritage Foundation. He has an excellent essay called The Conservative Case for Liberal Education in there. This is The Intemperate Professor by Russell Kirk. It's another anthology of his essays. The title essay is where he shares some of his experiences as a professor and what he notices going awry in the modern academy. This is The Politics of Prudence. And I'll tell you something fun about this. In the introduction, Kirk tells you who coined the term ideology. It was an educationist. It was a guy who had theories about education who believed that the correct way to teach students is just to fill their head with ideas. You just give them ideas as opposed to getting them to recollect the truth or drawing the truth out of them, which is what a good teacher does. But it's astounding just how much Kirk wrote about education. And he has another essay in The Politics of Prudence called Cultivating Educational Wastelands. And he maps out his own policies for reform of higher learning in there. This is Russell Kirk's Decadence and Renewal in the Higher Learning, where he talks about, among other things, his favorite places of higher learning, his favorite colleges that he discovered, the IHP, John Senior's IHP at the University of Kansas, and a second place called Thomas Aquinas College. And he said that he wished that his daughters would go there, or he said he thought it would be a great place for his daughters to go to school, founded by Ronald MacArthur. He writes a lot about Ronald MacArthur. And Kirk says something very interesting here. He says, as much as we talk about this school of Thomism or that school of Thomism, there really is just good Thomism and bad Thomism. The Laval school is good and everyone else is bad. Okay, he doesn't really say that, but I kid. This is Redeeming the Time, another Russell Kirk anthology, which is truly excellent, and that's where there is the essay about multiculturalism. So if you want, you can look them over. I also have a few very rare copies of National Review, the magazine that I mentioned several times.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your...
Thank you for having me. Thank you.